Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is March 14th, 2017. Following on the steps of the meeting of the Prime Minister and the President of the United States 3 weeks ago, the Ministers of Finance and Commerce and Trade will be meeting next week. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Cucek, and Dr. Nancy Snow. Today, we're also joined by Glen Fukushima. Welcome back, Glen.
Thanks very much, Tim.
This meeting that's going to happen next week, it's already being laid up with telephone calls and press reports of how people are positioning themselves.
Yeah, so I think when Prime Minister Abe met with President Trump on the 10th of February in Washington, he made this offer of a growth and employment initiative from the Japanese side. And I think the hope on the Japanese side was that this would be enough to satisfy the U.S. by offering Japanese companies to invest in the United States. And I think, frankly, the U.S. side really doesn't have many people in place. You know, at the State Department, there's only two people, the Secretary of State and the Ambassador of the United Nations, who've been confirmed. The Commerce Secretary recently was confirmed, and Treasury Secretary is confirmed, but the Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary levels have not been filled yet. And I think it's going to take, I would say, probably at least 6 months now for those positions to be filled. So I think that even this first meeting will be just a very preliminary meeting where I think probably it's going to be basically the Japanese side offering some ideas and the U.S. side listening. I don't think there are too many people on the U.S. side who are prepared to actually analyze and make counter offers or counter proposals about what needs to be done.
Well, they talked a lot about it on the golf course, and one of the issues that people are waiting for them to talk about is currency, Michael.
Well, currency is the big issue for the U.S. President Trump's advisor, Peter Navarro, who, as the head of this White House Trade Council, has put a lot of emphasis on that as being a major source of Japan's advantages in terms of the trade relationship.
They're playing with the yen.
That they're playing with the yen, and that the weakening of the yen that has taken place as a part of the first Abenomics, the first three arrows, the monetary easing, was effectively actually a policy of devaluing the yen.
And there's truth to that.
There is truth to that. The U.S. Side is not entirely mistaken in that. When Mr. Abe and his team are in country, when they're talking inside Japan or inside the Diet, they talk specifically about weakening the yen. It's only when they go outside the country to international conferences or to Washington that they suddenly say, no, that's monetary easing. It's not the same thing. So they've been playing a double game, and maybe they're going to be caught on it.
And let's be clear, too, what do you get from a weakened yen from Japan's perspective? You get this doubling, potentially, of the number of foreign tourists by 2020. So it's up to 20 million now. I think in January of 2017, it was up almost 25% from a year ago. So they want people to come and spend money here. It's not just about the trade of products, but it's about the exchange of persons. What's fascinating, though, with this dynamic is that you have reporting now, as Glen makes the point, there are so few people who we know who are in place, in position. So there's all this speculation. There was an article about a 5-minute phone call that these two had in anticipation of a meeting. That's not even news to me, but it shows what an information gap we have coming out of Washington.
People are tremendously trying to read the tea leaves, aren't they? Looking for some sort of indication of what's going on and what's coming down the path.
Yeah, so I think, as Michael said, there are people like Peter Navarro who have these views about currency manipulation. I think the president himself, at least since 1987, has been talking about Japanese manipulation of the currency. At the same time, you know, we do have people in the administration who are from the business community, whether it's, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury, head of the National Economic Council. So you have people with business background, and you also have people with military background. And so I think the Japanese hope and expectation is that these business people, the kind of traditional business people, especially in the financial sector, those people and the former military people will kind of hold things steady, although there are people like Peter Navarro and maybe Steve Bannon and others with a very, very much of a America First view that the whole trading structure needs to be changed fundamentally to advantage the United States and not Japan and other countries.
Well, it looks like the United States is looking for lessons from Japan, because isn't the president also talking about the value of the U.S. dollar so that exports become a little bit more attractive?
Yeah, so there was a report when Michael Flynn was still the National Security Advisor that one evening, like 3 o'clock, he got a phone call from the president asking, is it better for the U.S. to have a strong dollar or a weak dollar? And so I think I'm not sure that there's a clear view within the administration. I think that actually on this and many other issues, I think there are varying views within the administration. And one of the challenges is to be able to understand, who's going to have the influence. And I mean, I think Donald Trump's management style has been to hire people with different points of view, have them fight it out, and then at the end make the decision. So even for those people who are actually involved in the discussions, it's hard for them to predict what the final outcome is going to be.
Right. You're back and forth between, Tokyo, Washington, D.C., in New York as well. Perhaps you can give us some insight into William Haggerty, who has been nominated as a ambassador.
Actually, he hasn't been officially nominated yet. His name has appeared in several news accounts, both in the United States and Japan, as the person who is most likely to be nominated to be ambassador to Japan. And I just heard just yesterday from a senior Japanese government official that the Japanese government has
Blessed it.
Yeah, they've given their agrément, which is the French term that they use, where the host government gives the approval.
He passed the smell test.
And so this person was telling me that probably within the next week or so, the U.S. government will be in a position to make the formal nomination. And then from there, there's the White House investigation, the FBI investigation, the Senate confirmation process, and finally, I think most likely early summer to fall is when the ambassador should come, because I've looked into this. I think the earliest in recent years that a U.S. ambassador has come after an election is April. That's Tom Schiefer, who in the second Bush administration came to Japan, but in the first administration he was in Australia already as ambassador. So he had gone through all the paperwork, all the filings, all the procedures. All he had to do was go back from Canberra to Washington, D.C., go through the confirmation process for Japan. So he came in April. The latest in recent years is Tom Foley, who was late November of 1997. And there was almost 1 year between Mondale's departure and Foley's arrival.
A lot of contention going on there in the confirmation hearings, though, right?
I don't know it'll be I don't think it's going to be contentious. I think because Haggerty's had the business experience with the Boston Consulting Group and was involved with the state Republican Party in Tennessee. He was also head of the state's economic development.
He did a great job there, didn't he, for Tennessee?
I think so. So I don't think it's going to be controversial. I think he'll I don't know whether he'll sail through, but I think that I haven't heard that there's going to be any controversy. And the Japanese side has gotten good word about him. So. Yeah.
And there's no other second contender. I mean, is it impolite to have, we're going to have one potential candidate and somebody sitting in the wings? You usually ride with one?
No, I mean, it's almost always the case that the administration nominates someone. The last time I can remember is back in 1989, at the beginning of the George H.W. Bush administration. Mike Armacost and Gaston Seeger were considered the last two contenders, and then Mike Armacost was chosen to be the ambassador. But I think that there really hasn't been much contention since then about who would become ambassador.
He was a great ambassador, wasn't he?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Mike
Armacost
did a very good job. Yeah.
I have a question in terms of what you, as a former trade negotiator and familiar with both sides, when you were at USTR, there was a lot of emphasis on bilateral negotiations. Yeah. And in recent decades, they've pulled away from that into multilateral frameworks, the
regional
TPP,
and multilateral.
Regional and multilateral frameworks. Right. Now the United States wants to unilaterally impose bilateral negotiations on all of its trading partners.
Right.
Where do you, from your point of view between Washington and Tokyo, what's your read on that?
It's really a very interesting point, because I think it's actually absolutely true that in the 1980s, the focus was on bilaterals. The U.S. was doing bilaterals, Japan was doing bilaterals, and that's what both sides preferred. There was the GATT system, and then there was the bilaterals. But since that time, especially since the end of the Cold War, 89-90, increasingly things have become regional. There's APEC, there's ASEAN, and now TPP, right? And so actually the U.S. was kind of taking leadership, saying that let's have a multilateral framework and not just have bilateral trade agreements. So we have to protect intellectual property rights, we have to protect the environment, we have to do all these other things to set kind of the rules, for the structure, for the architecture of trade and investment.
Well, also the trade networks have changed with the supply chains.
That's right, exactly. So all of that, the economics have changed, the politics have changed, and the U.S. was kind of, as you say, moving more in the regional and multilateral direction, kind of dragging Japan along. Japan was, in a sense, in the beginning, initially was kind of kicking and dragging to go along, and now Japan kind of got to the point where they're saying TPP, that's great. We really want to do TPP. Now the U.S. has pulled back, and so we're kind of crossing paths. Now we're doing the bilateral. The Japanese wants multilateral, and especially with the rise of China, I think there's a view, especially among Japan and other countries in Asia, that it actually better is to have a multilateral framework with the United States heavily involved as a way to kind of counterbalance China. So it's quite interesting that what the Japanese used to like, bilateral, now they are preferring the multilateral. What the U.S. used to like, the multilateral, now the Trump administration says it's all bilateral.
Do you think this is a ploy, that Trump is using this as a kind of negotiation tactic, because actually bilateral really generates more windfall for the participants?
Well, I think Trump's view is that the U.S. will get more out of a bilateral deal, because I think his view is that if we do a multilateral deal, we have to give a lot of stuff, and also a lot of the things that we give, I guess he doesn't take much stock in things like protecting intellectual property rights, setting rules for investment, all of this kind of architecture stuff. I don't think that he has so much time for. I mean, as a businessman, I mean, he's interested in doing bilateral economic deals as a businessman, as a negotiator, not creating an architecture framework that the U.S. kind of leads, because I think he believes that the U.S. gives up too much. He believes the U.S. has so much power that if we do a bilateral, that we will be able to use our power to leverage and to get more out of the other party.
Dr. Snow, what do you think about the image of the
I'm
U.S.
amazed
using
at
that
Glenn
power?
because he's become quite a Trump expert.
Yeah.
Well, you have to be in Washington.
Well, you really do. So you've accepted him. You haven't signed the Change.org petition to impeach him, right?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. But I think if you read The Art of the Deal, I just spoke about this the other night at Temple University, the way that Trump likes to negotiate is more one-on-one. He doesn't like complicated things, right? He wants the bottom line. And a lot of the American people, at least half of the electorate, thought, yeah, we're getting the short end of the stick with these trade deals. And that putting America first or making America first again, it really worked rhetorically. And so we'll have to see how this plays out. But as a former State Department person, I wonder really where that architecture is going to go, because even in public diplomacy, that has sort of vanished. There's really, outside of Rex Tillerson, not much happening, not much coming out of the State Department. We didn't even see press conferences. They haven't even been communicating
Well,
with the press.
The last week, as you know, I mean, the whole focus in the Washington foreign policy community is how little power the State Department has. Yeah. The Mexican foreign minister went to Washington just a few days ago, didn't even go to the State Department or see Secretary Tillerson. He went to see Jared Kushner because Jared Kushner is being viewed by foreign countries as, in fact, the Secretary of State.
This
at
is
least for now.
unprecedented.
At least for now.
I've never seen or heard.
Slightly more
Well, in
powerful.
America, it's unprecedented. That the family should be in charge and is the real
Right.
power
That's
is
right.
familiar to many people around the globe.
Right, sure. But yeah, I was talking about the United States. I've never seen anything. I lived in Washington, D.C. 9 years, and the State Department was where it was at, foggy bottom, right? Everybody wanted to work there who was in international affairs. I think now everybody wants to maybe develop business skills, negotiation skills, because they need to sort of change with the times.
Not many resumes going to the Environmental Protection Agency.
That's right, with the proposed, 20% slash in the agency. Not only that, I would probably put the Department of Education will be also,
Energy. HHS.
Right.
But in terms of, okay, you talked about the way it plays domestically with the electorate, and that Donald Trump did that. But Donald Trump is also the leader of the free world.
Who said?
Yeah, but he is.
I'm sure he believes that, but,
from your own expertise with public diplomacy, the words "America first" to the rest of the world, that means America gets everything. right? America gets it all.
Right.
And what is your sense of that?
Well, look, if you have a cap, you can't give, making America or giving America a comparative advantage again. You can't get that on a baseball cap. You can only put make America great again.
Right.
So I know it sort of signals, it telegraphs to the world it's going to be about us all the time. But you look around the world, this nationalism trend is sticking in a lot of places. Let's take care of our own. Even with immigration, the drop in the number of illegals coming across undocumented, 40% drop in I think, February, coming out of Washington. That really shows, wow, at least it's going in the direction that Trump wanted and that so many supported. I wrote a piece in the Japan Times, though, about how this has been a crash of America's soft power advantage, that we were going to be a model for the rest of the world. And we're a new model. I don't know what it is exactly, but we have to get beyond just the Trump brand and I think accept that he's the president, but there is this bureaucracy that's in Washington that is continual, and there are a lot of really talented people, I think, who will continue to do the good work if you care about government in Washington, and many don't, though.
Right after the U.S. inauguration, where President Trump gave his inauguration speech, there was a front-page article in the Sankei Shimbun that I really recall vividly, which they said, well, the President Trump is saying it's America first, America is going to take care of itself and doesn't care about other countries. We here in Japan also, we have to be Japan first. We have to really take care of ourselves.
Sure.
So I think it does have the effect of having other countries think, well, we can't rely on the U.S. to be generous anymore. We're going to have to kind of take care of ourselves, and so it has to each country for himself or herself.
Well, Tokyo governor has picked up the same song.
Well, that's the Sankei Shimbun's long-time line. It's a realist paper. It believes in self-defense. It believes in a strong personal responsibility for Japan to take care of itself in the security sphere.
And I think
not so much
Trump
on the
gives
economics.
energy to that.
Gives energy to that. And so they're just going down the party line.
Yeah.
They haven't been converted in any way.
No.
So,
but I think they've been re-energized. It's good for America, so it's good for us too.
Well, a lot of people are still guessing. Glenn, what is your guess on how the trade negotiations, or if it's not even a trade negotiation, it's setting the table for further negotiations on the relationship between Japan and the United States? What's your guess on how that's going to pan out?
Well, again, we have Lighthizer at USTR, Peter Navarro. We've got Secretary of Treasury. We've got the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce, and each of these, I think, has a slightly different take. But one of the things I'm going to find very interesting, I'm going to watch with a lot of interest, is that Bob Lighthizer, who's going to be the USTR, has to be confirmed yet. He was a deputy USTR when I was at USTR back in the 80s, and he's written and said on many occasions that it's a mistake to think that Republicans are free traders. That when in 2008, for instance, when John McCain was running, Lighthizer wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times saying it's a mistake. You go back to Alexander Hamilton, go back to American history, Republicans are the ones who protect American jobs, people, companies, and so forth. He said, I was very proud during the Reagan administration, he says, that we restrained Japan from exporting to the United States steel, autos, semiconductors. We protected Harley-Davidson. So I'm wondering whether he would actually prefer to negotiate voluntary restraint agreements from Japan, because with the exception of agriculture, I don't know that there are a lot of American companies that are clamoring to get into Japan. I think the auto companies, for instance, in particular, I think they're more interested in keeping Japanese companies out of the United States, whether directly from Japan or from Mexico, as opposed to trying to get U.S. cars into Japan, which Japan's a shrinking market anyway, right? So I'm going to be very interested to see whether he's going to try to replicate some of the stuff of the 80s of trying to get Japan to restrain. And one of the real benefits of that, from the U.S. point of view, is that as opposed to slapping a 25% or 45% tariff, that it's probably not going to be WTO illegal. And if two consenting adults, agree that one side is going to not export as much as it used to, then who can complain, right? So I'm going to be very interested to see to what extent the energy is going to be on trying to open up Japan and get Japan to accept more American products versus restrain to the United States.
But you have to look on the Japanese side, who's going to be on the other side of the table from Lighthizer, and that's Seko Hiroshige. who is not someone who is known for his subtlety or his farsightedness. I have a personal bugbear with him about virtually everything.
No.
Yes, I do. And you have to work with the people that are there, and it's going to be because, as you say, it's going to be a long time before the lower echelons are filled in on the U.S. side. It's going to be a top to top, and seeing Wilbur Ross or Lighthizer across the table from SECO and then working from there, unless that we have a cabinet reshuffle and SECO's out, it's going to be rough going, I think. What's your take on that?
Well,
within your ability to speak in a diplomatic way.
Well, everything has to do with what's the alternative. If there's a least worst alternative or not, and I think frankly in the 1980s, and I'm not so sure about now, but in the 1980s, in many ways, I think it was easier for Japan to accept the notion of restraining exports than to accept the notion of opening up. Opening up and accepting imports create a lot more problems than restraining exports. Right. I remember when I was at U.S. chair that Watanabe Michio, then the MITI minister, would come to Clayton Yide, the U.S. Trade Organization, and say, now we're thinking 1.68 million. Is that target? Is that number okay? 1.68 million for cars to be exported to the United States. One could argue that Japan has changed a lot in the last 30 years. It's less of a managed economy, and therefore they are absolutely not going to agree to the notion of restraining exports. But, it depends on what the alternatives are.
Right. Well, apparently the president and the prime minister hit it off.
Yeah,
and
well,
it looks like
it's really interesting because, in contrast to the president's discussion on the telephone with the president of Mexico or the prime minister of Turnbull of Australia, it was very. He said we have great chemistry. Not only did I shake his hand, but I hugged him because we really feel good about each other, right? So, I was told by a number of people that Prime Minister Abe, to his credit, did a lot of preparation, a lot of study before he went, consulted psychologists, who basically told him, Trump is really an egotist. He's a narcissist. You got to really kind of stroke him and let him know that he's everything.
Let your hand be petted.
Great.
What a surprise, though, for a leader of the free world that he's an egotist.
One anecdote, which I think is really interesting, which I heard from some journalists and then I just got confirmed by some government officials, is that one of the ways on the 17th of November, when they had their meeting in Trump Tower, one of the many ways in which Abe tried to kind of get close to and bond with the president was to say, we got several things in common. One thing we've got in common is you have the New York Times as your enemy. I have the Asahi Shimbun as my enemy. I succeeded in crushing Asahi Shimbun. I hope you'll succeed in crushing the New York Times.
Wow.
And that really bonded them, apparently.
Really? That was said? That's
well, I don't know those exact words, but
Wikipedia, here I come.
But that's kind of the tenor. And so,
which explains the Asahi Shimbun's work on the Moritomo Gakuen scandal.
So I think that, I have to give, Prime Minister Abe credit. He really did study up on how to get close, how to bond with the president.
Right. But wait, now that he's done that, is that where Japan should go? Even Abe has said, I don't know how the other leaders of the G7 will now look at me now that I've done this.
I don't think he's too worried. I don't think he's too worried.
I think it's been smart. Yeah.
Well, isn't it interesting? In Washington, there have been some people who've said, our embassy, our government is really studying how Mr. Abe did it, how Prime Minister Abe did it, and he was so successful in handling the president. So we really have to study. So there are some people reacting that way. I know that there are many others who react differently. But,
so what do you think? Do you think the Trump-Abe relationship will carry us through? The ministers of finance and commerce and trade will be meeting next week. Let's see how that pans out. Please stay tuned.